The air in Iowa on May 15, 1944 was a thick, humid curtain, utterly foreign to the men stepping off the train. Feldwebel Hans Richter, a veteran of the desert campaigns, felt the moisture cling to his lungs, a stark contrast to the sand-blasted ruins of Tunisia he had last seen. The 6-week journey, from the sun-baked dust of North Africa, through the chaos of Norfolk Naval Base, and across the endless continent of America, ended here, in the middle of nowhere. Camp Alona sprawled across the flat prairie land, a sight that mocked the mountainous, claustrophobic Europe Richter knew. There were no forests, no peaks, just rows of boundless, fertile ground under a blazing sun. An American officer, his voice soft with a distinct Midwestern draw, stood on a makeshift platform, reading names from a clipboard. The officer's voice carried over the 300 veterans of the Africa Corps assembled in the processing yard. "You'll be working for local farmers, agricultural labor," the officer announced, his tone utterly devoid of malice, as if this were a simple business transaction. "You'll be paid 80 cents a day." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "Richter, you're going to the Zimmerman farm." Richter froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. Zimmerman, the officer continued, oblivious. "Schultz, you're with the Hoffmans." "Bieber, the Schmidts need help with corn harvest." "Brown, you're headed to the Becker place." A tremor ran through the ranks of the German prisoners. They exchanged nervous, incredulous glances. These weren't the names of their expected captors: Smith, Jones, Williams. The names associated with the mongrel American enemy described by Dr. Goebbels. These were their names. Names from their villages, from their graveyards, from their military rosters. Unteroffizier Paul Schultz leaned close to Richter, his whisper raw with shock. "Did he just say I'm working for someone named Hoffman?" "My mother was a Hoffman." The truth began to dawn with brutal clarity, shattering months of careful indoctrination. During the Atlantic crossing, confined to the bug-infested bowels of the Liberty ships, they had done the arithmetic to pass the time. 6 million Germans had immigrated to America between 1820 and 1920. 6 million. That was twice the population of Berlin. It was like lifting the entire kingdom of Saxony and transplanting it across the ocean. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years twisting this fact. Goebbels had repeatedly broadcasted, "Our racial brothers in America cry out for liberation. They are suffering, enslaved by Jewish bankers, starving in urban ghettos, begging to return to the Reich." The party line was that those who fled were weak, cowardly racial traitors who had failed in the homeland and now suffered in the hands of the enemy. But the slow, clattering train that carried them from the camp to the farms showed something else entirely. Every mailbox they passed bore witness to a different truth. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. Each name was a small, silent betrayal of everything they had been told. These were not the names of the enslaved. They were the names of the owners. On May 16, 1944, at 6 o'clock in the morning, Hans Richter stepped onto the Zimmerman property in Hancock County, Iowa. He couldn't see where the land ended. The corn rows vanished into the morning mist. A vast red barn, larger and more imposing than any building in his entire German village, rose from the flat landscape like a modern cathedral. The scale of the private wealth immediately felt obscene. Then, Otto Zimmerman walked out of the house. Electric lights blazed in every window, not just one meager bulb per room, but multiple fixtures. A casual, almost wasteful display of power, even at dawn, even in wartime America. Zimmerman was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing denim overalls that would easily cost a month's wages for a skilled worker back in Germany. He was, though Richter didn't know it yet, a sixth-generation American, his great-great-grandfather having left Bavaria in 1843, the very year Richter's own family had nearly starved in the same German region. Zimmerman spoke English with a distinct Midwest draw. "You must be Richter. Heard you boys were coming." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added one word. "Deutsch?" Richter, momentarily unable to form a German sentence, merely nodded. Zimmerman switched to German, rusty but functional, the syllables softened by generations of English, yet still unmistakable. "My grandmother insisted we learn, said we should know where we came from, even if we're never going back." The tour that followed systematically broke Richter's understanding of the world. Otto Zimmermann owned 640 acres. In Prussia, where the aristocratic Junkers who ran the military averaged 500 acres, anyone with 100 acres was considered the rural elite. Zimmermann, a descendant of Bavarian peasants, exceeded the most powerful aristocracy Richter had ever known. Zimmermann owned 2 John Deere tractors. Richter had seen exactly 3 tractors in his entire life, all belonging to the Wehrmacht. He owned a combine harvester that cost $2,400, an amount most German families would not see in a lifetime. He drove a 1942 Ford truck, a civilian owning a private vehicle despite the war. The house itself was a shrine to unimaginable comfort. Electricity throughout, indoor plumbing with constant hot water, an electric refrigerator humming in the kitchen, a Zenith radio in polished walnut, and a telephone mounted on the wall. Turn a handle and hot water flowed. No hauling from wells, no heating required. The luxury was not reserved for generals or party officials. It was the standard of a simple farmer. The final hammer blow was breakfast. Mrs. Zimmermann, born Catherine Mueller, served a meal that could feed Richter's family for 3 days. 6 eggs, just for him. Bacon strips piled high. Toast from white bread slathered with real butter, not margarine, not turnip spread. Orange juice, coffee with cream and sugar, both as if rationing never existed. "My boys are fighting in Italy," Zimmermann said, pouring more coffee from an endless pot. 3 sons. "Maybe against your friends." Strange world. He spoke without hatred, without anger, just a simple statement of fact. His sons were killing Germans while he fed Germans. Richter could only manage one question. "Your family. Why did they leave?" "Bad harvest. No future there," Zimmermann answered, his eyes drifting toward the boundless fields outside. "My great-great-grandfather walked from Munich to Hamburg, sold everything for ship passage, arrived with $17. And now I gross about $12,000 a year. Good year, maybe $15,000. Richter could not process the number. A German factory worker, if lucky and employed, made 2,000 Reichsmarks annually. The promise of the Reich was an empire. The reality of America was a peasant who was richer than the German aristocracy. The sheer volume of abundance was the first and most profound crack in the foundation of the Nazi worldview. The initial shock experienced by Hans Richter at the Zimmermann farm was not an isolated incident. It was a psychological operation unfolding across the American Midwest. On hundreds of farms, across Nebraska, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Texas, 30,000 German POWs were being confronted daily by the living proof of Nazi failure. The names themselves were the first agents of propaganda. Schlitz, Pabst, Miller, anglicized from Müller. The German soldiers had been raised to believe their racial brothers in America were suffering. Instead, they found the descendants of Bavarian peasants and Prussian farmers living lives of unimaginable, effortless wealth. The knowledge spread like wildfire through the camps. It was shared during the slow train rides between Camp Alona and the farms, whispered in the barracks, and debated over meager camp meals. The propaganda had been a carefully constructed fortress, but the sheer, tangible reality of American life was a wrecking ball. In Hancock County, Iowa, Richter's continued exposure to the Zimmermann household was a daily trauma to his ingrained ideology. The pantry tour, led by Mrs. Catherine Muller-Zimmerman, was a particularly devastating blow. She opened door after door, revealing shelves stacked to the ceiling with home-canned goods, hundreds of jars of tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches, and pears. Next to the canning sat store-bought goods, coffee, sugar, and flour in 50-pound sacks, even cases of Coca-Cola. "We could eat for a year without leaving the farm," she said simply, a casual statement of self-sufficiency. Richter remembered his mother back in Hamburg, queuing for 4 hours for a single loaf of stale black bread amidst the bombed-out ruins. The official German ration was 1,200 calories per day. The Zimmerman family's casual consumption for one day exceeded his mother's weekly allowance. The wealth was ubiquitous. The census data, unknown to the POWs but clear in the landscape, showed that by 1940, Wisconsin was 40% German American, with cities like Milwaukee being nearly 70%. This was not a tiny isolated group of exiles. This was a vast, successful civilization built by the very people the Reich had labeled weaklings. The Germans who had fled the old country had rebuilt it, piece by piece, name by name, in the American prairie. New Ulm, New Munich, Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne. Towns in Minnesota that mocked the chaos of the fatherland. A powerful psychological shift occurred in Texas, where Private Klaus Fischer was assigned to work in a town called New Braunfels. The town was founded by Prince Karl of Solms-Braunfels in 1845. Fischer was aghast to learn that the founder was not fleeing poverty, but fleeing the future he saw coming. The wars, the nationalism, and the blood that would soak European soil for the next century. The aristocracy had chosen peace over glory, and their descendants now owned cattle ranches spanning thousands of acres, oil derricks pumping black gold, and banks holding mortgages. They were supposed to be dying, Fischer wrote in a letter home, knowing it would be censored. They were supposed to need us, but they're richer than anyone I knew in Germany. They drive Cadillacs, they have swimming pools, mother, for recreation. The ideological confrontation escalated in Reading, Pennsylvania, where 300 POWs arrived at Reading Army Airfield. Reading was 90% Pennsylvania Dutch, a corruption of Deutsch, German. The POWs were processed by American soldiers with unmistakably German surnames. Sergeant Kleinmitt, whose grandfather left Westphalia in 1882. Corporal Dietrich, whose family fled the Kulturkampf. Private Albrecht, a third-generation American whose name echoed through Prussian history. All American soldiers, all fighting against Germany. Private Wilhelm Braun couldn't comprehend it. In Nazi ideology, these were Volksgenossen, racial comrades. Blood should call to blood. Instead, Sergeant Kleinmitt's son was flying B-17s over Berlin. Corporal Dietrich's brother commanded a tank destroyer in France, and Private Albrecht's cousin had died at Anzio fighting Germans. At the Yoder farm, where Braun worked, the German-American family hosted dinner. Conversation flowed between English and Pennsylvania German, a dialect 300 years old, frozen in time, carrying words no longer used in modern German. It was a preserved slice of Germany, but a version that had been sterilized of the poison of militarism. "Why didn't your grandfather stay?" Braun asked Mr. Yoder. Yoder responded with a phrase that cut through all of Braun's training. "Stay for what? To be drafted into someone's army? To die for some prince? Here we choose our own wars." The irony was devastating. America was fighting a war it chose to fight for liberty. Germany was fighting a war one man, the Führer, chose for the entire nation. The final element of the shock was the deep, unshakable sense of belonging the German Americans felt for their new nation. On Sunday, July 9, 1944, 25 POWs were permitted to attend services at St. John's Lutheran Church, Missouri. The congregation was 100% German American. The sermon was about forgiveness, The pastor, Reverend Dietrich, had lost a nephew in Italy to German artillery, yet he preached peace while his nephew's gold star hung in the church window. After the service, the congregation served lunch. The tables groaned under the weight of food: ham, roast beef, potato salad, 3 kinds of pie. Frau Steinberg, whose grandfather left Prussia in 1852, told Private Gus Meyer why her family left. "My grandfather left because there was no future in Germany, only wars and hunger. Here we found peace. My father never held a gun. My husband never held a gun. My sons, they hold guns now, but they chose to, for America, not for a king or Kaiser or Führer." That night, Meyer wrote in his diary, a quiet, powerful realization of self-betrayal. Everything we were told was backwards. The Germans who left found paradise. We who stayed found hell. They kept what was good about being German: the work ethic, the craftsmanship, the music, the food. They discarded what was poison: the militarism, the obedience, the hatred. The German POWs had been sent to America expecting to find a weakened, inferior enemy. Instead, they found a reflection of their better, more prosperous selves, a reflection that indicted every choice Germany had made since the mid-19th century. The sheer, peaceful abundance was a more powerful weapon than any B-17 bomber. As the summer of 1944 wore on, the initial shock of abundance gave way to a deeper, more insidious revelation: the sheer industrial power of American agriculture. This was not the quaint, backward enemy the Nazis had described. This was a machine of endless production. The harvest season across the American Midwest became a forced re-education for the 30,000 German POWs working on German-American farms. The irony was overwhelming: Schmitz guarding Schmitz, Millers feeding Müllers, Wagners supervising Wagners. The same names, separated by an ocean and a century, now stood on opposite sides of a barbed wire fence. Except one side had chosen democracy and the other dictatorship. Hans Bauer, working for Emil Bauer, no relation, in Nebraska, was confronted by the scale of the machinery. Emil owned 1,000 acres of corn, land his great-grandfather had started with nothing but strong hands. The equipment was a revelation: John Deere tractors that did the work of 50 men. International harvester combines that could clear a field in hours, not weeks. Automated milking systems processed hundreds of gallons of milk daily. "In Germany," Hans told Emil, "we still harvest with scythes. Some villages still use oxen." "We did too," Emil responded simply, 40 years ago. "But here progress is profitable. In Germany, tradition is law." This was the core difference. In America, tradition was a memory. Progress was a necessity. In Germany, tradition was a paralyzing burden, glorified by the very regime that promised a modern empire. The realization that America's strength was not just wealth, but mechanized efficiency, hit the POWs hard. They had been told they were fighting a materialistically soft enemy. Now they saw an enemy that produced food and fuel with a terrifying, effortless capacity that dwarfed the desperate, manual labor of the Reich. They learned the true source of America's inexhaustible military supply: the farm, the German heart of the American army. The POW's realization of American industrial might was soon matched by the unsettling discovery of the German contribution to the war effort against them. The propaganda had insisted that German Americans were a marginalized, secretly loyal population. The reality was a deep, complex betrayal of that myth. Emil Bauer's 3 sons were in uniform, their photos sitting prominently on the mantel in crisp dress uniforms. One was in Europe, 2 in the Pacific. "They volunteered," Emil said proudly, "the day after Pearl Harbor. Didn't wait for the draft." "To fight Germany?" Hans asked. "To fight tyranny," Emil corrected. "There's a difference. My grandfather left Germany to escape men like Hitler. Turns out Hitler followed us here anyway, so we'll finish it here." The family patriarch, the farmer, saw the war not as a national conflict, but as the final completion of his great-grandfather's escape plan. The war was personal, a defense of their chosen freedom. Emil even showed Hans letters from his son in Europe, censored but readable, confirming he was with Patton's Third Army, racing across France, killing Germans. "Does it hurt?" Hans asked the American Bower. "Your German son killing Germans?" "My American son," Emil corrected again, emphasizing the nationality. "And yes, it hurts, but it would hurt more if the Nazis won." The cognitive dissonance peaked in September 1944 at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. A POW named Friedrich Müller openly lost control, screaming at farmer Johann Miller, whose family had left Hesse in 1847. "Race traitor! You abandoned your folk! You polluted your blood with mongrels!" Miller, 60 years old and built like the barn he raised with his own hands, set down his coffee. In slow, deliberate, accented German, he responded, "My grandfather left because Germans were starving. Here I feed Americans, Germans, English, Polish, Irish, even—" He paused, fixing Friedrich with a hard stare. "Idiots like you." Miller's farm produced 50,000 gallons of milk per year, 10,000 bushels of corn. His daughter was studying medicine at college. His son was designing bombers for Boeing. "Your Führer promised you all this," Miller continued, "but you had to steal it from others. We just worked for it. Took us 3 generations. No stealing required." The raw, moral clarity of the American farmer dismantled the core principle of Nazi expansionism in a way no government pamphlet ever could. The truth of the American-German war contribution began to filter in, overwhelming the prisoners' belief system. 23 million German Americans made up 15% of the U.S. population. They contributed 20% of American soldiers. 1 in 5 Americans killing Germans was of German descent. Dwight Eisenhower, of German ancestry, commanded all Allied forces. Chester Nimitz, of German ancestry, commanded the Pacific Fleet. His grandfather left Germany specifically to avoid military conscription, the planes turning German cities to dust. The B-17 flying fortresses were built by Boeing, a company founded by Wilhelm Boeing, a German-American. The ultimate betrayal of the Nazi narrative was the realization that the mongrel nation had used the descendants of its own German refugees to achieve industrial and military supremacy. The men who had fled the Kaiser and the petty princes were now commanding the largest military machine in human history, efficiently destroying the very ideology that had scorned their grandparents. As autumn deepened into the stark American winter of 1944, the psychological pressure on the German POWs reached its climax. The experience had become an exercise in forced cultural immersion, culminating in the quintessential American holiday, Thanksgiving. Throughout November 1944, thousands of German-American families, driven by a blend of Christian charity and shared heritage, invited the prisoners into their homes. The scenes were deeply surreal. Enemies and cousins sitting at the same table. In Kansas, the Kruger family, originally Kruger, hosted Private Heinrich Kruger, a confirmed third cousin. The American Krugers owned 800 acres of wheat, a grain elevator, and shares in a railroad. The German Kruger owned nothing. His apartment in Hamburg was ash. The American Kruger patriarch looked at his German relative and said, "We could have been you, if great-grandfather had stayed. We could be sitting in your ruins instead of our plenty." The power of that simple statement, the stark visualization of their reversed fates, was the hardest lesson of all. The food served was a culinary reflection of the cultural shock. Roast turkey, a purely American invention, alongside German staples like sauerkraut and pumpernickel. But then came the utterly alien, incomprehensibly American items. Sweet potatoes with marshmallows and pecan pie. Texas through and through. The combination of German heritage and American prosperity was an indigestible symbol of freedom. The cultural confrontation reached its ethical peak on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1944. Thousands of German-American churches opened their doors to the POWs. From Pennsylvania to Texas, enemies worshipped together. They sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, written in Austria, translated into English, and now sung in both languages simultaneously. German POWs and German Americans, their voices merging in a hymn that Martin Luther himself had championed. In Fredericksburg, Texas, a town founded by Germans in 1846 and named for a Prussian prince, the irony was at its sharpest. The German Americans had rejected the authority of Prussia, but kept the cultural shell. POW Heinrich Roth sat at the Hoffman table. 3 of the Hoffman sons were in uniform, their photos watching from the mantel, 1 in the Pacific, 2 in Europe, all killing for America. Frau Hoffman served a 4th helping, forcing food on the emaciated soldier with a determination that reminded Roth of his own German grandmother. "Eat, eat," she said in German. "You're too thin." In Germany, there were no first helpings. Here, 1 meal exceeded a week's ration. Roth finally asked the question that haunted them all. "Why did your family leave Germany?" "To be free," she said simply, pausing over the carving knife. "Free to succeed, free to fail, free to be left alone." The new mathematics of war. By January 1945, the constant exposure to truth and abundance led to an inevitable collapse of the Nazi worldview. The ideological mathematics simply failed to add up. The POWs realized that they had been fighting a losing battle against a mirror image of themselves, a superior version. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of all Allied forces, was of German ancestry. His family name was Eisenhower before Anglicization. Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet, had a grandfather who left Germany specifically to avoid military conscription. Now his grandson commanded the largest naval force in human history. The Boeing Company, which built the B-17 flying fortresses turning German cities to dust, was founded by Wilhelm Boeing, a German-American. The Hershey Company, founded by Pennsylvania Germans, made the chocolate ration bars that fueled the American soldier. Germans fighting on turnip soup faced Americans powered by German-American chocolate. In February 1945, at Camp Stark, New Hampshire, Private Joachim Fisher watched an American propaganda film reel. It casually showed the Ford River Rouge plant in Detroit, where a completed car rolled off the line every 49 seconds. The narrator mentioned that Ford's workforce was 30% German-American. Fisher recorded his final, devastating realization. "We thought we were attacking a mongrel nation, but the mongrels are us. Germans who mixed with Irish and Italians and Poles and Jews. And they're stronger for it. We kept our blood pure and grew weak. They mixed theirs and grew mighty." The German Americans had achieved true master race status, but they did it through democracy, hard work, and assimilation, not conquest and hatred. They were the ultimate victors, having made the correct choice in 1820, 1848, and 1869, the choice to leave. The cowards who ran had become the heroes. The traitors were the wise. The runners became the winners. The American military censors allowed these letters through. They wanted these small bombs of truth to reach the shattered homeland, knowing that the most effective tool for dismantling Nazi ideology was not a B-17 bomb, but the quiet, undeniable envy of an Iowa farm. The final, desperate months of the war brought news that hammered the final nails into the coffin of the Nazi worldview for the prisoners of war. The American radio, free of propaganda and reporting hard facts from the front, became the ultimate tool of re-education. In March 1945, the news reached the camps that the Rhine had been crossed and the Ruhr was surrounded. German cities were falling daily. The POWs, who had been fed a diet of total victory and fanatical resistance, listened to voices like Walter Winchell and Edward Murrow telling the truth about Germany's irreversible collapse. They were forced to reconcile the official claims of the Reich with the evidence on the farms. If Germany was winning, why was Farmer Zimmermann, a descendant of German peasants, producing more food and wealth than the entire Prussian aristocracy? At the Becker farm in Iowa, Private Ludwig Hoffmann helped with the spring planting. The Beckers were preparing to plant 1,000 acres of corn, the seed alone costing more than most Germans would see in a lifetime. "What will you do after the war?" Becker asked Hoffmann. "If there's anything left," Hoffmann responded. "Rebuild." "You could stay," Becker said simply. "Apply for immigration. Lots of POWs are planning to." It was a quiet, revolutionary truth. Thousands of German prisoners were falling in love with America. Not romantically, but practically. They saw what Germany could have been, what Germans could accomplish with democracy, freedom, and peace. They realized that in America, success was not earned by loyalty to a political party or by military rank, but by hard work and land ownership. The inverted universe. The ideological universe inverted itself in April 1945. April 12, 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt died. News of the American president's death reached the camp swiftly. The German POWs stood at attention as American flags flew at half-mast. They were saluting the man their Führer had called the paralytic Jew lover. German-American guards, the descendants of Bavaria and Prussia, cried openly, mourning an American president like a father. This act of collective, non-ideological grief was stunning to the prisoners, who were only accustomed to mandatory, staged loyalty to a dictator. The deep sorrow showed them the difference between forced obedience and genuine civic loyalty. 2 weeks later, the camps exploded with impossible news. Hitler was dead. In the barracks, arguments raged among the POWs. Was it suicide or murder? Hero or coward? The debate was fierce, fueled by years of fanatical devotion. But out on the German-American farms, there was no debate, only cold, hard finality. "Good riddance," said Farmer Otto Zimmermann. "Should have happened in 1933. Would have saved everyone trouble." The German-Americans, who had fled the Kaiser and had fought in the trenches against the Kaiser's sons in the First War, viewed Hitler not as a national leader but as a contagious disease, a relapse of the militarism they had paid dearly to escape. Their quiet relief was the ultimate verdict on the Nazi regime. Then came VE Day, May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The German POWs were no longer prisoners of a nation at war with Germany. They were prisoners of a nation preparing to rebuild Germany. At German-American farms across the Midwest, the scenes were surreal. The Schmidts celebrated defeating Germany. The Müllers toasted Germany's surrender. The Hoffmanns thanked God that Germany lost. Private Wilhelm Braun asked his host, Farmer Johann Weber, the question that summarized their bewilderment. How can you celebrate defeating your own people? Finally, Lang, Weber responded with the simple, transformative statement that sealed the psychological victory. Germans aren't my people. Americans are my people. Some of them just happen to be named Schmidt. The final educational weapon. With the fighting over, re-education began in earnest. The POWs were shown footage of the concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Many refused to believe, claiming it was Hollywood trickery. But the German Americans believed, and their belief was the final weapon. Some recognized the places. Some had relatives who dined there. In Wisconsin, Farmer Miller told Private Friedrich, the man who had called him a race traitor, "My cousin wrote from Munich in 1938, said terrible things were happening. We tried to bring him here. The State Department said no. He disappeared in 1941. Now I know where." The German Americans became the bridge of credibility. They were trusted because they were German, yet they were believed because they were successful. They were living proof that Germans could thrive without fascism, and their testimony about the Holocaust shattered the last remnants of the propaganda shield. By September 1945, Japan surrendered, and the war was truly over. But 300,000 German POWs remained in America, working the harvest. The labor shortage kept them there, and the lessons continued. The POWs had been eating 3,000 calories daily. Their families in Germany survived on 1,000. The disparity was a brutal fact, driven home by the impending reality of repatriation. Ships were arriving to take the men home, but home to what? Dresden was ash. Hamburg was rubble. Berlin was divided. The return journey was inevitable, but the men leaving America were not the men who had arrived. They were filled with chocolate bars from Mrs. Zimmerman, cigarettes from Otto, and a realization of the staggering potential of democracy. They carried back the seeds of a new Germany, one built not on blood and iron, but on John Deere tractors and the freedom to choose your own path. September 1945. Japan had surrendered, and the global war was finally over. Yet 300,000 German POWs remained in America. Due to the severe labor shortage in the United States, they continued working on farms, building roads and harvesting crops. The experience, intended as punishment, had evolved into the most intensive long-term democracy lesson in history. The Zimmerman farm in Iowa served as the final crucible for Hans Richter. He had been there for 16 months, gaining 40 pounds, learning to drive a tractor, discovering ice cream, and reading the American Constitution in a German translation given to him by Otto Zimmerman. The true moment of closure came when Otto Zimmerman's 3 sons returned from the war. One was missing his left hand, but all were alive. They shook hands with Richter, enemies turned laborers, now almost friends. "No hard feelings," said the eldest son. "You did your duty. We did ours. Ours won." The choice of the future. Repatriation began in earnest. Ships arrived to take the POWs home. But home to what? Dresden was ash. Hamburg was rubble. Berlin was divided. The men who had been eating a healthy 3,000 calories daily faced the prospect of returning to Toto families who survived on 1,000. The physical health of the POWs was a visible, living indictment of the war they had fought. Hans Richter boarded a Liberty ship bound for Europe. In his bag, he carried tangible proof of the impossible: chocolate bars from Mrs. Zimmerman, cigarettes from Otto, and crucially, a letter of recommendation should he ever return to America. In April 1946, Richter arrived at Bremerhaven. He returned to a Germany that no longer existed. His hometown was in the Soviet zone. His family had fled west with nothing. He found them in a refugee camp outside Frankfurt. His mother initially didn't recognize him. He was too fat, too healthy. His cheeks had color. His eyes weren't hollow. He told his brother about the Zimmermans, their 640 acres, their electricity, their abundance, their German name and American heart. Lies, his brother snapped, gaunt and cynical. Propaganda. Staffly. No, Richter insisted. He pulled out the photograph. Him and Otto Zimmerman by a John Deere tractor, the endless Iowa fields stretching green and gold behind them. His brother stared at the proof, then finally spoke. "Our cousin Wilhelm immigrated to America in 1923. Father called him a coward, a traitor." "Maybe," Richter said, looking at the rubble that was Frankfurt. He was the smart one. The ripple effect. Architects of the New Germany. Of the 378,000 German POWs held in America, thousands returned as fundamentally changed men. They hadn't just seen the arsenal of democracy. They had seen democracy itself, working, thriving, creating abundance from prairie dust. These former prisoners became the essential human bridge for the post-war recovery. They became mayors, teachers, and politicians. When the Marshall Plan arrived, they understood why America could afford it. They had seen the farms, the factories, the infinite production firsthand. The foundation of the West German economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, was laid by men who remembered American efficiency. Klaus Fischer, who worked in Texas, became an agricultural advisor. He introduced American farming methods, mechanization, and crop rotation learned on the Becker farm. Wilhelm Braun, who picked apples in Pennsylvania, started an import business, bringing American goods and, more importantly, American business practices to Germany. Many of the architects of the new German Constitution were former POWs who learned English and saw American institutions functioning with transparent efficiency in the camps. The ultimate irony and the complete ideological defeat of the Third Reich was achieved through this quiet transformation. The Germans who abandoned the fatherland had actually saved themselves and, ultimately, helped to save the idea of Germany. The cowards became the heroes. The traitors became the wise. The very names the Nazis had scorned, the Zimmermans, the Millers, the Hoffmans, had won before the war even began. They had chosen correctly in 1820, in 1848, and in 1869. They had chosen America. Hans Richter returned to Iowa in 1955, legally, with immigration papers sponsored by the Zimmermans. He worked their farm, saved money, and bought his own land. He married a school teacher from Cedar Rapids, a third-generation German-American. His children spoke English. Sometimes, at the Lutheran Church, Richter met other former POWs. They shared a secret knowledge. They had seen paradise and hell, and they knew the final verdict of history. The German POWs' journey to America was not a campaign of conquest, but a campaign of conversion, the most successful psychological operation of the entire war. They learned that the true measure of a nation was not its capacity for war, but its capacity for abundance, freedom, and peace.